there is a 50% chance, at best, as the Times reports, that should this bill pass, there's a chance that the European Court in Strasbourg will issue what's known as an interim injunction to stop the flights getting off the ground.
Let's talk about Rwanda. According to the government's official legal advice, front page of the Times, the Rwanda scheme has at best a 50% chance of actually going ahead. Is that perhaps generous?
That's a very good question. Well, it says, 50-50 basically. And it's fair to say that the Prime Minister and Number 10 would not have wanted to wake up this morning to that front page headline, given that MPs are about to vote on this legislation on Tuesday. And this is going to be a pivotal week for Rishi Sunak. This basically, the long and short is, this advice that was given was signed off by James Eadie, who your listeners may not know, but is the top lawyer that the government consults on issues of national importance. And James Eadie's advice is basically that there is a 50% chance, at best, as the Times reports, that should this bill pass, there's a chance that the European Court in Strasbourg will issue what's known as an interim injunction to stop the flights getting off the ground. Now, the reason why this is concerning, and is already this morning causing a lot of concern among Conservative MPs, is because Rishi Sunak has made clear that this bill, he says, this bill will stop a foreign court from blocking the policy.
Let me drill down into that a tiny bit. If the whole point of this bill is, and do tell me if I misunderstood this, but if the whole point of this bill is that this is stuff we can do even if foreign courts and other bodies and other aspects of law say we can't, no, we can. How can the ECHR stop it?
So because we haven't, this is the crucial thing. This is why Suella Braverman and Robert Genrich have effectively, Suella Braverman has opposed the bill. She says it doesn't go far enough. And Robert Genrich has quit over it and said he doesn't believe it goes far enough. And that's because the Prime Minister went for a middle way option, which did not include basically disapplying the European Convention on Human Rights from the legislation. So basically that means that appeals can be made to Strasbourg, and Strasbourg has the right to implement these injunctions. Now, there is something in the bill, and was previously in the illegal immigration bill, which could allow the government to continue with the flights. Basically, the government has taken powers in the legislation to effectively just ignore those injunctions, so those flights could continue. However, that could lead to some significant disagreements within both the Cabinet and the Conservative Party, because it's my understanding that quite a few members of the Cabinet, potentially including the Attorney General, are concerned that at the point that the government ignores those injunctions, it then may be in breach of the European Convention on Human Rights. And that is something that the government has so far refused to do. But then that puts us in breach of our international obligations. So it's a complicated picture, but that's why this advice is causing a lot of concern this morning.
And that is about what happens if the bill passes.
Correct.
Right, so if you're getting to 50-50 after the bill passes. So the vote is on Tuesday.
Yes.
How likely is it to pass, do you think? Because, I mean, it doesn't need a huge rebellion among the Tories for it to not pass, and they're rebelling from two sides and in quite large numbers.
Well, yes, that's true. It only needs 28 Tory MPs, effectively, to vote against it, and Sunak's majority has gone. However, I think actually on Tuesday, there was a lot of concern when Genrich resigned that the government could lose this vote, and that would be fatal to the bill and the Rwanda policy. But as the days have kind of progressed, there's been a big whipping operation in government to try and convince rebels to vote for it. And I think the general conclusion amongst MPs on the right of the party, and I think most of the kind of moderates in the One Nation caucus, is that actually this bill does need to be put through second reading because they don't want to actually kill the policy. What they want to do is change it and make it tougher on the right. So they're going to vote for it on Tuesday. And then what will happen after that, the timeline thereafter, is basically there will be several weeks of what's known as committee stage, and that's the point where it will get difficult for the government, because the rebels will be looking to table potentially amendments to the legislation to insert the stuff that they wanted in the first place, and that's to disapply the ECHR in the legislation. So that's the full fat option which the Prime Minister chose not to go for, and then so that will take place before Christmas, and then when the MPs come back in the new year, that's when we'll have third reading in the Commons. And that, again, will be a crunch vote. And that's where, if the government rejects those amendments, we could really see this bill potentially face defeat.
If the right of the party end up voting for it on Tuesday, does that mean that Robert Genrich might vote for it, having resigned over not wanting to vote for it?
That's a very good question. Robert Genrich has so far not said how he intends to vote. I think there's a chance that he could vote for it and then look to attach himself or even lead one of these rebel amendments later down the line. There's also the option, of course, that he could abstain. And abstentions are also a concern for the government, because the more Tory MPs abstain, the smaller their majority becomes. And you've got to remember that every single opposition MP is expected to vote against this. So the government just doesn't need its rebel MPs not to vote for it. They need everybody they possibly can to vote for this bill.
What insight can you give us into the psychodrama between Sunak and Genrich? Because it seems to be a sort of bubbling, almost like sort of Jeffrey Archer type novel of a political story, that they'd always been close, and then there was this sort of schism, almost on a sort of like a sort of Cameron Gove type way. This schism between people who'd formerly been political bedfellows and now suddenly aren't. Should we see this as being a point of principle for Genrich? Is there an element of careerism in there, and how does Sunak see it?
Yeah, it is interesting. It's an interesting comparison you made between Gove and Cameron. They were a trio, actually, because if you include Oliver Dowden, they were the three amigos who signed that now famous op-ed where they backed Boris Johnson for the leadership. And both of them came into Parliament around the same time. They both got ministerial jobs around the same time, and they were totally politically aligned at the beginning of their careers. Robert Genrich, however, since he was made immigration minister by Sunak when he became prime minister, his views have definitely hardened on immigration, and that's where the tension between the pair has grown, because Genrich has seen the realities, the operational reality of how the Home Office works, the difficulties the Home Office is having in actually making the government's policies reality. And he strongly believes, and we should bear in mind he is a lawyer, he strongly believes that the only way forward was to take the toughest possible option in legislation. And I think it's fair to say that over the last few months, he has, like Suella Braverman, been raising his concerns privately with the Prime Minister and Number 10. And I think he felt that, given his personal friendship with the Prime Minister, the fact that he wasn't seen as a rival to him like Suella Braverman, that his arguments may have had more weight than they did. And look, I'm not going to just try and speak for him, but speaking to people who are close to him, it was certainly apparent that he felt that he was not shown the full amount of courtesy or respect maybe from certain people in Number 10. So that certainly weighed on his decision. And also, I think there was an element of he was overlooked for promotion when Suella Braverman was sacked. You know, he's been gripping this issue for the last year, and yet when it came to it, the Prime Minister decided to put James Cleverly into the post, somebody who was known to have softer views on illegal immigration than both him and Suella Braverman.
Perhaps it's too cynical of me to even wonder, but he must also be thinking about, you jump ahead to the next leadership election, whenever that may be, which one would assume will presumably happen at some point in the next year, simply because an election, you'd imagine, will happen in the next year. And having been the guy who did this, there's the chance that it makes him a sort of a significant figure in the body of the party in the way that he perhaps wouldn't have been beforehand.
That's totally true, because until, I'd say, 4 or 5 months ago, Robert Genrich was very much seen as Rishi Sunak's guy, whereas by the time he resigned earlier this week, he genuinely is very highly thought of now among the right on the party. And that's the same calculation that Suella Braverman has always made, that at the end of the day, when an election happens, if the Conservative Party faces a drubbing at that election, there's going to be a much smaller group of MPs return to Parliament. And the likelihood is that the complexion of the Conservative Party will be more to the right than it is currently. There'll be less one nation Conservatives. Many of them are under threat either by Labour or the Liberal Democrats. And therefore, the electorate that they will be competing for to begin with, because it's first decided by MPs and then the membership, will be a lot more to the right, and they will be looking for a new direction away from Rishi Sunak. And it's very hard to see the party shifting further to the centre or to the left.
Yeah.
So I think that you could argue there is a calculation potentially there.
Jumping ahead to next week, Rishi Sunak will be in front of the COVID inquiry. How worried will he? I mean, he's got a lot on, but how worried will he be about that? You can sort of imagine him being like, "Not now, COVID inquiry," but that's going to be happening, in the midst of everything else. Will that be a major, major headache for him?
Yeah, it's going to be a very difficult week. He's had no respite. He'll be coming straight into it'll be a bit of a baptism of fire, actually, on Monday. So the COVID inquiry, the Prime Minister is likely to be grilled quite intensely on his views on lockdown and also the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. I'm told that he's been doing a lot of prep behind the scenes, despite everything that's been going on with Rwanda, to get ready for this inquiry. And you'd expect Rishi Sunak to come very prepared. That's something that he prides himself on, being on top of the detail. But he does have some quite difficult questions to answer. The inquiry has heard a lot of criticism about the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which he pioneered as Chancellor. And you've had Patrick Vallance, the former Chief Scientific Advisor, and Chris Whitty, former Chief Medical Officer, saying that they weren't consulted on that. My understanding is that Rishi Sunak intends to argue that suggestions that his scheme may have fueled the second wave of COVID are not fair and not borne out by the evidence. And I think he's probably going to point to other European countries that didn't have that scheme, but still saw that second wave occur at the same time, and point to other areas where infections were spreading, such as schools and universities. But I think the area where he may come a bit more unstuck is he did an interview with Fraser Nelson in The Spectator during the Tory leadership contest. And during that interview, he gave some very strident views on lockdown. He kind of presented himself as being the person in government who was pushing against lockdown measures. And I think whilst that obviously played well during the summer when he was competing to win the leadership contest, when he's put under scrutiny by, forensic questioning by a COVID inquiry lawyer, and we should bear in mind the COVID inquiry's principal function is to work out whether the government did enough to protect life, then I think he could struggle really on several grounds there.
Okay, look, very briefly before I let you go, Nigel Farage leaving the jungle tonight, either in a blaze of glory or a blaze of less glory. Are there proper political considerations here? Does it matter to the government what happens to Nigel Farage next?
Nigel Farage has been living in the Conservative Party's head for years. So yes, inevitably. And if you look at the polls, the Reform Party, which he still is heavily associated with, is the president of, is clawing points off the Conservative Party. And Nigel Farage clearly went into the jungle to potentially launch a political comeback. It seems obvious to everyone that in the next few months we're going to be hearing a lot more about his political ambitions. And yes, it's definitely a concern for the government. I've spoken to lots of people in government and on the backbenchers who are worried about that. And I should just point out that Richard Tice is currently the leader of Reform, but someone was pointing out to me the other day that actually it's a weird structure. It's actually a private company or a limited company, Reform, and Nigel Farage owns the majority shareholding in that company, which means should Nigel Farage decide he wants to come back and take over, I think he'd find it quite easy to do so. So I think we should all be watching in the new year for potentially the Farage comeback.